I've had to admit over the years that there have been many things which rabbinical school did not adequately train me for. One of them has certainly been the opportunity and unfortunate reality of having to consider how we talk about and how we commemorate the monarchy here in the UK. This past week, in learning more about the rituals and precedents and background as to how Jews have prayed for and mourned the monarchs of Great Britain, has been a really interesting learning experience. And I don't know that I've really understood previously how deep the ceremony goes. Watching the queues pile up in London the last few days strikes me as such a profound image of the affection and intensity with which many people approach the monarchy. I have to admit, it still feels a bit strange to me, having grown up in the States and having been carefully instructed in the merits of republicanism, which I've seen actually shift in some way while being here in the UK. Not only can I appreciate more the benefit of having the monarchy and the power it has to bind the nation together, but I also can appreciate more deeply the role that it's played in British history and undoubtedly will continue to play, even in a slimmed down form, even in a slightly altered form. I have no doubt that in some way this continuous line of kings and queens will persist. And in thinking particularly about King Charles having now taken the throne, and in thinking about Rosh Hashanah only a short time away, we actually do a lot of thinking about monarchy and about the idea of kings in Judaism. Overall, it's easy to say there's an ambivalence towards kings in Judaism. Even the first Israelite king was unsure. The people insisted on having a king, and the prophet Samuel, who was at the time in charge of both the civil and military and spiritual life of the people, tried to talk them out of it, but they insisted, and God eventually relented, God who was originally opposed to having a human king for the Israelites. And Samuel, as a result, appointed Saul the first king, and David after him, and Solomon after him, and many more thereon, although split between two kingdoms after the division of the monarchy. But even in the midst of the Torah itself, before there were any kings, the statements are made about if you appoint a king, what the regulations should be that are placed upon him. And the regulations is the right word, because the Torah makes it very clear that the king is to refrain from having too many material objects, is to refrain from having too many wives, is refrain to have too many horses, and is actually primarily understood as a teacher and as a judge. The king is there in order to be the judge of the people and to sit and learn to write a Torah for themselves and to have it by them always. When they go out to war, when they come back, they are meant to constantly be surrounded by the words of Torah and use those to judge the people whom they serve. The king, in the concept of the Israelite tradition, the Jewish tradition, the Hebrew tradition, is really quite different than the absolute monarchs of old Europe. It's probably closer to the way that we conceive of the monarchy today. Not quite a symbol, but not quite the absolute decree that we may have imagined. That privilege is reserved for God, and so much of our tradition uses language that is very skeptical of the idea of human monarchy and authority. We say multiple times a day, in multiple different ways, Ein melech ela ata, there's no king but you. And that sense of God being the one true king is actually quite deeply woven into Rosh Hashanah. One of the special sections of the Musaf service that we say on Rosh Hashanah, the Malchuyot, is all about the imagery of God as king. The Aleinu prayer that we associate with that moment, in which the Shliach Tzibor bends down onto the ground and bows before the ark, is all about the idea that we only bow down to God. We don't bow down to human kings. And yet, many Jews today will feel quite moved and probably quite grieved in mourning the passing of Queen Elizabeth, and there's no doubt that it has a role to play in people's lives. But it's important to distinguish, perhaps, the difference between the monarchy as a human institution which serves a national aim and which has a cultural value, versus the idea of the king which we see embedded in religious thinking about God, in which there is an absolute decree, in which there is judgment, theme of Rosh Hashanah, in which there is the opportunity for us to bow and to show reverence and obedience in a way that we shouldn't and don't to human authorities. And when we look at Rosh Hashanah, when we stand and bow and bend and prostrate even for Aleinu in the Malchuyot service of Rosh Hashanah, it's important to have in mind that separation. Because as we welcome King Charles to the monarchy, and we appreciate, and I certainly do appreciate, what the monarchy does in order to bind together this nation of many different peoples and cultures and languages, I also understand and remember that there's a difference between what we talk about when we talk about the monarchy and that which we talk about when we use the word melech, malkeinu, in our services. It's hard sometimes to separate them. And there's definitely an idea, as it states in the Talmud, that human kings and authority and queens are meant to be an imitation of the divine king and queen and authority in God. But it is an imitation, ultimately, and it is different. And it's important that the distinction doesn't become erased. So we can, I think, do both. We can mourn Queen Elizabeth, recognize the immense loss to this country and someone who gave her life of service. We can welcome and celebrate King Charles and appreciate what it is that he brings to this notion of monarchy, which is serving the people today. And we can also understand that both of those things are in some way distinct from the notion of melech that we celebrate and will commemorate multiple times in only a week's time on Rosh Hashanah. That notion, ha-melech, the king, the one to whom which we bow, is something very different than human authorities. And neither of them is benefited by us forgetting that distinction. So on the day of remembrance, and on the day of judgment, on the day of the shofar's call, in which we definitely appreciate the pomp and circumstance, we can have in our mind the sense of both the human king and the benefits of that, and the sense of the divine king and the benefits that has to our spiritual journey throughout this period and beyond Rosh Hashanah. Shabbat Shalom.